What happens when a 6-year-old girl, sitting quietly in first class, is suddenly slapped by a flight attendant? How does one small, silent moment ignite a storm that freezes access to 42 airports all within 2 minutes? This is not just a story about an incident on a plane. It's about courage, dignity, and a mother's fierce determination to make a broken system listen. Meet Amira Sloan, a calm, observant child who presses a small silver button, activating the Aurora Protocol, a revolutionary ethics system designed to stop injustice before it spreads. And her mother, Dr. Leona Sloan, a brilliant architect of this technology, who faces a world unwilling to hear the silent cries of children like Amira. What price will they pay for standing up quietly but powerfully? Can a child's silence change an entire industry built on profit and prejudice? And will the world finally confront the uncomfortable truth behind discrimination that still haunts the skies? Join us now to explore this gripping story set high above the clouds where every second counts, every action echoes, and one girl's quiet bravery rewrites the rules of justice in the air. If you believe dignity matters for everyone, hit like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin. She was 6 years old, wearing a soft purple hoodie zipped all the way up, her small legs dangling just above the carpeted floor first-class seat. 2. She wasn't fidgeting, she wasn't playing. She was simply sitting there, quiet, still drawing something in her notebook with a blue crayon that had long since lost its wrapper. Across from her, a flight attendant with a stiff bun and stiff posture stared with narrowed eyes. The woman's name tag read Sandra Blake. Her voice was calm, but clipped like scissors. "You don't belong here." The little girl blinked once, raised her eyes without fear, then said, "My mom bought this seat." Sandra took a step forward. Passengers in the surrounding rows started to glance up, not because of shouting. There wasn't any, but because of the strange stillness, the kind of tension that makes people's skin buzz before they even know why. I said this section is for premium guests. Sandra's voice tightened. She didn't get to finish the sentence, because the girl, still calm, still childlike, tilted her head slightly and asked, "What makes me not premium?" That was when the slap came. It was not hard, not brutal, but it was loud enough. Loud enough to stop the man in seat 3A mid-sentence on his laptop. Loud enough for a teenage boy near the front to mutter, "Wait, did she just hit her?" Sandra froze. The little girl did not. She blinked again, once, then slowly reached into the side pocket of her lavender backpack. What she pulled out didn't look like much, just a small flat silver disc. No screen, no logos, just one round button in the middle. She pressed it. Nothing beeped, nothing flashed, but far away, somewhere deep inside a federal network in Washington, D.C., a quiet alarm went off. A protocol went live. Aurora sequence initiated minor passenger violation. Tier 1 source ID, a Sloan, 3 rows back. Dr. Leona Sloan looked up from her tablet. She hadn't seen the slap, but she had heard the stillness that followed, and she had heard her watch buzz. A single vibration, Aurora trigger code, A6. She stood up slowly. Her voice, when it came, was low, unshaken, but every syllable landed like a stone. "Did you just touch my daughter?" Sandra turned visibly startled. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. You slapped a 6-year-old. She was being disruptive. She told you her mother bought the seat." Leona took one step forward, still calm, still steady. "You didn't correct her behavior. You corrected your discomfort." The entire cabin was listening now. Phones were out, some recording, some just pretending not to. The woman next to Amira looked stunned, mouth slightly open, hands frozen on her travel pillow, and still, the girl said nothing. She had gone back to drawing. She sketched a square and wrote inside it, "Not a place for me." Then she scratched it out and drew another square next to it. Far away in D.C., red alerts were now flashing across a hidden dashboard, not available to the public, but very familiar to Leona Sloan, because she had built it, the Aurora Protocol, a layered digital ethics safeguard developed for high-risk transit environments, rejected by 4 airlines, dismissed as excessive and never before triggered. Until now, 42 airports, all connected through Aurora's silent grid, received immediate ethics suspension notices for JetBridge Atlantic. Their ratings froze. Their ESG-backed funds paused mid-cycle, their crews flagged for tiered review, and back on Flight 1091. The seatbelt sign remained on, but the silence had shifted. Sandra Blake stood by the galley monitor, typing something quickly into a phone. Eyes darting nervously, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Folks, we've been asked to hold departure for just a few minutes. Appreciate your patience." The door at the front of the cabin opened, but no new passengers boarded. Instead, 3 individuals in navy jackets stepped into the aircraft. No expressions, no confusion. Federal Transport Ethics Division. One of them said quietly, "We need to speak with the cabin crew." All of them, now gasps, weren't loud, but they were real. Leona remained still. Amira looked up from her notebook. "Are they here because of me?" Leona knelt beside her. "No, baby. They're here because of what someone did to you." Sandra tried to recover. She misunderstood. "It was just," one of the agents cut her off. "We'll discuss this off the aircraft." They escorted her down the aisle. No handcuffs, no shouting. Just removed like a policy that had quietly expired. The cabin was quiet again, but this time the silence didn't feel like fear. It felt like accountability. Amira leaned in closer to her mother and whispered, "I think the button worked." Leona looked down at her and smiled. "Just a little." It did. 3 rows back, the hum of the aircraft was barely audible over the storm that had already begun to gather inside Leona Sloan's chest. She stood still in the aisle. Her heartbeat was steady but slow, like something that had trained itself to wait. Not panic, not rush. Just wait for the moment when things stopped pretending. The cabin lights had dimmed slightly in the front. Someone in business class whispered, "Did she really hit the kid?" But no one moved. Leona kept her eyes on her daughter. Amira sat in seat 2A, back straight, knees swinging gently, her hands still sketching calmly. There was no trace of fear in her posture, no tears, just a kind of stillness that made adults uneasy. Sandra Blake, the flight attendant, had been escorted off, her voice trailing behind her in a string of excuses that no one believed. The FAA agents know, not FAA anymore. Leona reminded herself the Federal Transport Ethics Division, FTED, had taken over with cold precision. The Aurora Protocol was fully live now. The button her daughter had pressed was not a toy. It was not symbolic. It was real. Connected to a system that had taken Leona 10 years to build and 3 governments to convince into silent approval. And now it was speaking for them. Leona's smartwatch blinked again. Aurora Trigger A6 confirmed. Escalation Tier 1. Network cascade engaged. She tapped gently on the screen to acknowledge. No one else in the cabin knew what that meant. Not really. A woman across the aisle had tears in her eyes. A man up front had stopped pretending to check email. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed. Not through chaos, but through an invisible realignment. The air itself felt different, heavier, like something sacred had been broken, and everyone now had to decide what side of the fracture they were on. A soft chime echoed through the intercom. The captain's voice came back, thinner this time. Thank you for your continued patience. Folks, ground control has requested we remain at the gate for a few more minutes. We'll keep you updated, but no one believed that the delay was about weather. Sandra Blake's absence said more than any intercom message could. Her coworkers had disappeared into the galley or slipped behind curtains. They didn't want to be seen right now. Leona slowly walked toward the front. Every step felt measured, deliberate. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even visibly upset. But something about her presence made the other passengers sit up straighter. She stopped at her daughter's row and knelt gently beside her. Amira turned the notebook so her mother could see. On the page, she had drawn a door. "There's a button under it," Amira said quietly. Leona looked at the tiny details, the hinges, the crack of light under the frame, the silver dot drawn with perfect placement just below the knob. "What does it open?" Amira shrugged. "I don't know yet." Leona didn't answer immediately. She didn't want to cry in front of her daughter, not because of shame, but because something inside her had tightened to the point of trembling. Then she placed her hand over Amira's and said softly, "Maybe it opens the kind of place we were always supposed to be allowed into." She stood again, her back straight as the agents approached her row. "Dr. Sloan. Yes, I'm Agent Voss. Ted? We're coordinating with Aviation Command. There will be a full review. We've locked all current ethical routing access for JetBridge Atlantic, effective immediately." Leona nodded. "Thank you. Is your daughter all right?" "She's stronger than she looks." Voss paused for a moment, glancing at the sketchbook, then back at Leona. "Ma'am, we need to ask you a few questions when we land. For now, you may remain seated with your daughter. Please let us know if you require any further support." Leona nodded again. Her tone never rose above calm, but everything she said felt final. Across the cabin, phones were being put away slowly, not because the moment was over, but because people had started to understand this was bigger than they could capture. Someone whispered to a colleague, "Isn't that Leona Sloan, the one from Ethica, the transparency group?" Another responded quietly, "She's the one who built that flight scoring system, the one the airlines refused to use." Leona heard them. She didn't react. She just sat beside Amira, adjusted her daughter's hoodie gently, and exhaled. The air was thick with questions. What happens next? Who else is involved? Are we part of something historic or just an uncomfortable delay? The truth was all of those things, but no one knew yet that the Aurora Protocol had triggered far more than just an incident report. It had locked 42 airports into audit mode. It had suspended 24 ESG-linked funding cycles. It had flagged a personnel sharing matrix across the Continental Flight Group Alliance. And it had done all of it within 2 minutes of a child pressing a single button. Leona looked out the small window beside her. Rain had begun to tap gently against the glass, soft, rhythmic, but steady. She thought about the years she had spent trying to convince regulators that silence was not a lack of harm, that just because no one shouted didn't mean nothing had happened. She had written dozens of reports, been dismissed as overprotective, as alarmist, as an academic with no practical understanding of how the industry worked. But she understood more than they had ever let her prove. She had spent years watching people like her be treated as a threat in spaces they paid to enter. She had watched children be asked to move, mothers told to stay quiet, elderly passengers ignored, flight crew told to escalate, then penalized when they did. And all the while, people would say, "Well, at least it didn't turn into something big." Until now. She reached into her bag and pulled out her own copy of the Aurora Manual, printed, bound, 76 pages. She had annotated it over the years. She had updated it after every policy revision. But there was one note she had written on the inside cover that she never erased. If my daughter ever needs to press this button, may the world have the courage to hear her. She closed the folder and looked at Amira. The little girl had leaned her head gently against her mother's side, notebook still open, crayon still in hand. Leona placed her hand over Amira's shoulder and whispered, "You did everything right." Amira looked up and asked, "Are we still going to Washington?" Leona smiled just a little. "We are. Will they be mad at you?" "No, sweetie. They're just finally awake." And the cabin remained quiet, not because people were scared, but because for the first time in a long time, they knew someone was watching, and this time they couldn't pretend they didn't see. In Washington, D.C., 2,000 miles away, from Gate 12 of Portland International Airport, a red dot blinked on a matte black screen. The room it glowed in was silent. There were no alarms, no buzzers, no announcements, just a single light pulsing on a wall-sized panel inside the Federal Transport Ethics Division's Secured Operations Center. Then it turned orange, then yellow, and then the screen filled with cascading data feeds, route overlays, and personnel tags, all flowing from one identifier trigger ID A. Sloan age, 6, Tier 1. Agent Miriam Cho adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. She had seen protocol tests, she had run hundreds of simulations, but this was no test. This was a real-time escalation. She reached for the secure line. Voice steady. Live trigger. Aurora Protocol. Confirmed activation. Lock all CFG routes for JetBridge Atlantic. Audit mode on 42 nodes. Ethics filters maximum sensitivity. Across the room, technicians began typing. Their screens exploded into motion. Names of flight crews, badge histories, ESG link chains, behavioral compliance records. The protocol had been built for speed, for silence, for systems that ignored words, but could not ignore code. Miriam did not smile. She knew exactly who had written this structure. Dr. Leona Sloan, the same woman who had submitted Aurora to the Department of Transport 5 years earlier. Rejected twice, modified, resubmitted, rejected again, then finally accepted under conditional deployment terms only. Invisible until it wasn't. She tapped another command on her panel, route PDX to IAD Flight ID JB1091 event tag. Violation of minor passenger protocol. Subtag contact, confirmed response underway, back on the plane. Amira shifted slightly in her seat. Her crayon had snapped in two, but she kept drawing with the shorter piece. She was working on a diagram now, a kind of tree with wires instead of branches, circles at the ends, like data nodes. She didn't know the words for what she drew, but she had seen her mother work on things like this late at night. A girl at school once told her she was weird for loving diagrams, but right now, being weird felt useful. In her own quiet way, Amira was processing, not with words, not with panic, but with structure, with a sense that something unfair had happened, and the world had shifted in response. She was 6, but she was not confused. Across from her, Leona watched the crew. One of the remaining flight attendants, Ella Chen Young, new to the airline, was pale and stiff near the front galley. She had watched Sandra slap the girl. She hadn't intervened. Now she looked at the floor, unsure of what to do next. Leona stood again, not abruptly, but enough that every eye in the first 6 rows turned to her instinctively. She stepped forward and gently addressed Ella May. "I ask your name." The woman looked up slowly. Ella. Thank you for staying." Ella nodded, her mouth tight. "I didn't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything now." But someone might need you to speak later. Truthfully, fully. Ella's eyes watered just a bit. Not from guilt alone, but from the quiet force in Leona's voice. It was not angry. It was not cruel. It was undeniable. In the operations center in Deke, Miriam Cho was pulling up Leona's profile. Academic credentials. Lead architect of Ethica Systems. Former advisor to Senate Ethics Subcommittee. Developer of Aurora and its cousin Protocol. Sentinel Light. She paused on one line in the dossier. Parent guardian to Amira Sloan, Miriam murmured to herself. Of course it was her. Another technician approached, ma'am. Should we notify the press? No. Should we alert JetBridge HQ? They'll know soon enough. What about the other airlines in CFG? Lock them out of the ethical grid for 72 hours pending their own review, ma'am. That's going to trigger a lot of, yes it will, and still, she didn't smile. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about truth. Truth wasn't supposed to need noise. It just needed to be seen. Back on Flight 21, Amira had fallen asleep, her head tilted gently against the window, the blue crayon resting between her fingers. Leona pulled a small blanket over her and sat beside her daughter again. She could feel the tension in the cabin had lessened, not because things were fixed, but because a response had finally arrived. Someone had struck her child, not hard, not repeatedly, but deliberately. And for once, the world had not waited until the bruises bloomed. Leona stared ahead. Her mind slipped back to the original idea. She remembered sitting alone in a lab at 2 a.m. after a man had told her her system was theoretical fluff. She had whispered to herself, then I'll make the theory hurt. And now it did. Not physically, but reputationally, financially, structurally. Sandra Blake's badge had already been deactivated by internal systems. Her name flagged in the Cross Airline Conduct Registry. Her career was unlikely to continue, but that wasn't the point. Leona didn't want revenge. She wanted reverence for dignity. Amira stirred in her sleep. Leona leaned down and whispered, "You don't have to fight to be seen. You just have to press the truth into the world and let it echo." At the same moment, in New York, a broadcast producer checked the newswire and paused. New ethics lockdown hits JetBridge Atlantic after child passenger alert. The producer frowned. What in the world is the Aurora Protocol by morning? They would all know the door to the aircraft had closed again. Sandra Blake was gone, escorted out without a uniform, without her title, without her badge. She had said nothing on her way down the aisle. No apology, no parting glance, only silence. But even in her absence, the weight of what she'd done lingered like turbulence that wouldn't pass. The air in the cabin felt different now, denser somehow, like something sacred had been cracked, and everyone was waiting to see if it would heal or splinter further. Leona Sloan sat with her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't scrolling her phone. She wasn't drafting emails. She wasn't even speaking. But her presence still filled the front of the plane like she was made of something older than steel and quieter than fear. Amira, still curled next to the window, had fallen back asleep. Her notebook lay half open on her tray table, a drawing of a staircase that led into clouds, each step labeled with a single word. The top one read, "Belonging." Ella Chen stood near the front galley, shoulders tight. She glanced toward Leona every few minutes, unsure whether to approach or stay invisible. In her chest, guilt and hesitation twisted like vines. She had seen it happen. She had done nothing, not because she didn't care, but because she had frozen. Like so many do when the moment arrives and their courage doesn't. The captain's voice came through the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be preparing for takeoff shortly. We thank you for your patience and asked that all passengers return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. The instructions were standard, but this flight no longer felt routine. A woman across the aisle from Leona leaned forward and whispered, "I saw the whole thing. I have it on video if you need it." "Thank you," Leona said, without looking up. "You handled it with grace. If that were my child—" She trailed off. Leona turned to her tone soft but firm. "If it were your child, the protocol wouldn't have been needed." The woman blinked. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean I know what you meant." A pause hung in the air like a held breath. Then the woman sat back in her seat, thoughtful, ashamed. The flight began taxiing. The engine's low hum vibrated through the floor as the plane inched toward the runway. But even with the motion, the cabin remained eerily quiet. Most passengers still weren't using their screens. No one asked for headphones or drinks. Something about what they had witnessed or almost missed kept them still. Ella finally stepped forward. She knelt beside Leona's row, speaking just above a whisper. "I'm sorry I didn't do anything. I should have stepped in." Leona looked at her for the first time directly. Her gaze wasn't angry, but it was searching. "Do you know why you froze?" Ella nodded. "I was scared I'd lose my job. You didn't think about the girl I did, but I also thought, if I say something, then I'm choosing a side, and if I choose wrong, I'm gone." Leona exhaled slowly. Her voice dropped even lower. "And now that you've seen what the silence costs." Ella swallowed. Her eyes were glossy. "It costs more than a paycheck." "Yes," Leona said. "It always has." She didn't lecture her. She didn't shame her. She didn't ask for an oath. She just nodded slightly and turned back toward the window. The plane began to lift. The wheels left the ground with a soft tremble, and the Pacific Northwest coast fell away beneath them. But inside, elevation did not equal escape. Leona's watch pulsed once. She tapped the screen. A message appeared. "Aurora Cascade Complete CFG Ethics Grid. Suspended initial report filing window. Open passenger witness testimonies requested." She opened the secure app and began to input a brief statement. Not about Sandra Blake, not even about the slap, but about what didn't happen before it. No one had asked why a 6-year-old black girl was sitting in first class alone. No one asked if she needed anything. No one made sure she was okay before making sure she belonged. She typed with the steadiness of a surgeon. Her words were not angry, but they carried the quiet finality of someone who had seen too many gentle people broken by polite cruelty. Her mind drifted back to a flight from Atlanta when Amira was 3. A woman had asked to switch seats because she didn't feel comfortable beside a toddler who looked like she might cry. The flight attendant had obliged. No questions asked. Then again, in Dallas, a gate agent had double-checked Leona's ID twice when she scanned in for first class. "Just in case," they said. And again in Boston, a man who tried to take her overhead bin because he thought it was mislabeled. The list was long. It always had been. But today, the button had done something the world hadn't expected. It listened. Amira stirred beside her and rubbed her eyes. "Are we flying now?" "Yes, baby, we are." "Is she gone?" "Yes, did I do something wrong?" Leona turned fully to face her. "No, sweetie, you did something very right. You let someone know you needed help." Amira paused. "But I didn't cry." "You didn't have to. What if they say I made it worse?" Leona brushed a curl from her daughter's forehead. "Sometimes, baby, making it worse is just the beginning of making it better." From across the cabin, an older gentleman in a press suit nodded to Leona. His eyes were kind. He didn't speak. He just raised his cup slightly in acknowledgement. A silent thank you. The clouds outside thickened, but inside the aircraft something began to clear. A man in row 5 lowered his phone. He had been typing a tweet and paused midway. He deleted the sentence, then started again. Flight Tumult 91. A 6-year-old got slapped for existing in the wrong row. Her mother built the system that turned the sky around her into justice. And I just realized I've been part of the silence for too long. He hit send, and for the first time in years, felt like he had spoken somewhere, over the Rockies. The cabin lights had dimmed into a soft golden hue. Most passengers were quiet, not because they were asleep, but because no one knew how to return to normal. Normal felt like an insult. Normal was the place where Amira had been slapped, and everyone had almost looked away. Leona sat upright, shoulders relaxed but alert, her hand resting gently on the armrest beside Amira's. Her daughter had drifted back into light sleep again, but not the deep, peaceful kind. She shifted now and then, small twitches, like her body was still bracing. Leona noticed. She always noticed. Her child had never been a loud sleeper, never needed to be rocked or sung to. But since she was born, Amira had responded to silence like it was music. She trusted stillness more than speech. That was part of what made what happened so unbearable. Sandra had broken that trust, and the world almost let her. Leona's phone buzzed softly again. Another update from the FTED. Sandra Blake had been formally terminated. The incident flagged under Section 7.9 of the Passenger Dignity Mandate. FTED had also frozen Sandra's participation in the crew transfer network for Allied Airlines, which meant she would not be rehired quietly under a different uniform. It was small, but it mattered. Leona put the phone down and exhaled. She stared out into the darkness beyond the window. The stars above the wing glimmered faintly, veiled by high clouds. In a way, they reminded her of the conversations people avoided, the ones that only became visible when the lights were low and the distractions disappeared. She thought of a moment 2 years ago, a different flight, a different city. She had been seated next to a woman who asked, politely, what she did for a living. When Leona explained she designed ethical enforcement systems for public transport infrastructure, the woman had nodded vaguely and said, that sounds important, but isn't it a bit much? That phrase haunted her. A bit much, as if being treated with dignity was something extra, as if being protected from assumptions or prejudice was an upgrade. She glanced down at Amira's drawing again, the staircase to belonging. The words scribbled gently on each step. Acceptance, safety, voice, love, truth, and at the top, belonging. She had no idea her daughter even knew these words, but somehow she did. A voice from across the aisle spoke, quiet but clear. Dr. Sloan. Leona turned slightly. A man, mid-40s, tie loosened, hands resting on his laptop. He looked nervous, not hostile, like someone who had been rehearsing this moment in his head for the past hour. Yes, I wanted to say something, if that's all right. Of course I'm in compliance. At JetBridge, I handle the ethics liaison reports. I've seen your name on the protest letters and rejected audits. I always thought you were... Well, I didn't think it was personal. I just thought the system worked well enough. Leona tilted her head. And now I realize it works well enough for people like me. He looked down at his hands. I'm sorry for what your daughter went through. And I'm sorry for being part of the group that ignored the parts of your reports we didn't want to deal with. She let the silence stretch for a moment before answering. What's your name, Mason? Mason Dyer. Mason. Thank you for saying something. A lot of people don't. I didn't before either. But you did now. He looked at her. Something in his face softened. Do you think things will really change? Leona considered the question carefully. Yes, but not because people suddenly care. They'll change because silence got expensive. Mason blinked. That's harsh. It's not harsh. It's math. She turned her attention back to the window, and Mason sat back in his seat, more thoughtful than before. Behind them, another passenger, an older black woman in her 70s, reached into her purse and pulled out a tiny silver pin shaped like a book. She pinned it to her cardigan, slowly, deliberately. Leona noticed. The woman nodded toward her. My granddaughter works in code enforcement. She told me about Aurora when they first denied it. I didn't think I'd see it used in my lifetime. Leona smiled softly. Neither did I. You built something they couldn't ignore. I just wanted them to stop pretending we were the problem. The woman leaned closer. We always knew we weren't the problem. We just needed proof they couldn't unsee. That line stayed with Leona. Proof they couldn't unsee. She looked again at her daughter, now dreaming with her hands curled under her cheek. So small, so full of ideas, and already carrying the weight of a system too slow to care and too polite to admit it. Another soft chime rang through the cabin. The captain's voice again. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude. You're now free to move about the cabin. Thank you for flying JetBridge Atlantic. It was a strange thing to say. Thank you. As if nothing had happened. As if this were just another flight. Leona got up quietly and walked toward the restroom. Not because she needed to go, but because she needed a moment to be alone. She stepped inside, locked the door, and stared at her own reflection. Her eyes were tired, her cheekbones sharper than she remembered. There was a tension in her jaw she hadn't unclenched since takeoff. She took a breath. Then another. What are you doing? Leona? The voice in her mind was her own. Not judgmental. Just real. Are you starting a war? No, are you healing something? Maybe are you doing this for your daughter? Not only then why she didn't answer right away. Then, finally, because I want her to grow up in a world that doesn't need a button. She turned on the faucet and let the water run cool over her fingers. The hum of the plane behind the walls buzzed like a distant storm. And still, the question hung inside her. Will it be enough? She returned to her seat. Amira opened her eyes and reached for her hand. Are we almost there? Not yet, but we're getting closer. 3 hours into the flight. Something strange began to unfold in the cabin. It started with whispers, not loud, not panicked, but curious, careful. Passengers glancing at their screens, refreshing news feeds, noticing headlines that hadn't been there a moment before. Ethics lockdown hits JetBridge Atlantic after child passenger incident. Sources confirm federal oversight of CFG flight routes. Anonymous source. 6-year-old activates emergency rights protocol mid-air. The title scrolled faster than anyone could read them all. And with every new headline, the weight inside the aircraft shifted. Not physically, but emotionally, socially. People began to sit straighter. A woman in 3C stopped watching a sitcom and opened a notepad. She began typing furiously. A man in the exit row put his tablet down and closed his eyes. His hands clenched slightly in his lap. Even Ella Chen, tucked quietly behind the curtain in the forward galley, noticed the way the noise in the cabin had changed. Not louder, not messier, but aware. This cabin is being watched. The feeling was like a camera clicking on. No announcement, no obvious lens, Just the knowledge that the world was now paying attention to what had happened on this plane. Ella checked her own phone. She hadn't posted anything, hadn't spoken to any press. But somehow her name had already begun to circulate. Crew witness, unnamed observer, possible testifier. She leaned against the galley wall and closed her eyes. What happens if I speak? What happens if I don't? In her mind, she replayed the moment. Sandra reaching over, the sharp motion, the sound, the pause. She had flinched when it happened, but she hadn't stepped forward. Now her silence was part of the story, and not the good kind. In row 2, Leona was aware of the shift as well. She hadn't opened the news. She didn't need to. She could feel it in the way people looked at her now. Not just curiosity, not just pity, but reverence, caution, as if she were made of something dangerous. She was used to it. When she was 29, she had submitted a report on systemic bias in air travel to the Senate Subcommittee on Transportation. They'd filed it quietly, too quietly. At 32, she built Aurora, a real-time ethical response engine. It had been dismissed as speculative. Now it lived in every corridor of power that once ignored her. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen lit up with a notification. Private message, sender K. Holt subject watching you. Time 2 minutes ago, Leona opened the message. We saw what happened. I'm pushing for a formal hearing under the Passenger Rights Reform Act. I want Amira's name protected. But I also want her courage documented. We don't get moments like this often. Call me when you land. Senator Karina Holt-Leona stared at the message for a long moment. Her fingers hovered over the reply icon. But she didn't type. Not yet. Instead, she turned toward her daughter. Amira was awake now. Quiet. Calm. Drawing again. This time it was a series of boxes linked by arrows. A flow chart. Each square labeled input, reaction, judgment, echo. What are you making? Amira looked up. A feelings map. Leona smiled. Do you want to explain it? Maybe later, okay? A moment passed between them. Then Amira asked softly, Are they going to talk about me on the news? Probably will they say my name? I don't think so. Good. Do you want them to? Amira paused. No, but I want them to understand. Leona looked at her daughter. So young, but already carrying the wisdom of someone twice her age. They will. They have to. Amira turned the page and started another drawing. A tree again. But this time the branches were longer, wider, more full. Behind them, Mason Dyer stood up from his seat and walked slowly to the galley. Ella Chen looked up, surprised. Can I help you, sir? No, I think we need to talk. Ella nodded, uncertain. I was in ethics, at corporate. I think you know that already. She didn't answer. I didn't know it would happen like this. None of us expected it to go public. She folded her arms. But it did. Yes, it did. And I think you and I might be two of the only people on this flight who can testify to how the system actually works. Ella frowned. You mean how it fails? That too. But also how it hides. How it allows things to keep happening without traceable consequence. Until today, Ella looked away. I didn't step in. I know. Neither did I. That's why we have to now. She looked at him, uncertain, then slowly nodded. Okay. Back in the main cabin. Leona closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about what came next. An inquiry, media coverage, probably hearings. The airline would scramble to contain the fallout. There would be apologies. There always were. But there was something else she had seen beginning to take shape. A pattern. Passengers talking to one another. Staff reflecting instead of deflecting. people considering their own silence. Maybe it wasn't change yet, but it was resistance, the kind that grew in quiet spaces, the kind that began with diagrams in a child's notebook, the kind that whispered, "I will not let you disappear me." The plane shuddered gently as it hit a patch of turbulence. Just a bump, but enough to jolt a few cups on tray tables. Amira looked up. "Are we falling?" "Nope, just a shift in air." "Oh, sometimes it feels like that when things are changing." Amira nodded, then drew a small circle on the next page of her notebook. She labeled it calm. A few rows behind them, a flight attendant picked up the intercom and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, just a small bump. Nothing to worry about. Please remain seated." But Leona smiled faintly. There was something to worry about. For the people who thought silence would keep protecting them. For the executives who thought children didn't notice the rules that bent around them. For the systems that had gone unexamined too long. Because the cabin was still being watched. And this time, the world wasn't going to blink. At 35,000 feet, time passed differently. Seconds felt longer. Thoughts felt heavier. And for Leona Sloan, every breath now carried the pressure of something larger than personal grief. She stared out the window, watching the moonlight ripple along the curve of the engine. Beneath them, the world was a blur of shadows, but inside the cabin, everything was sharp, each detail, every glance, the weight of 100 unspoken reactions. She felt it all. Amira was sleeping again, this time more peacefully. Her notebook rested gently against her chest. The page it was open to held a diagram labeled with tiny, perfect handwriting. It read, "Impact Map." Each bubble held a word. Sandra, protocol, silence, mama, me. Leona exhaled slowly. She wasn't ready for this level of awareness from her daughter. And yet, part of her was. She had raised Amira to understand the world, not fear it, to question patterns, not people, to trust her instincts, even if they made others uncomfortable. And now, because of that, a system had cracked. Leona turned as she heard footsteps. It was Ella again. She approached quietly, holding a tray with 2 cups of water and a small cloth napkin folded neatly between them. "I thought you might want something." "Thank you." Ella placed the tray on the table gently and stood beside the seat. "I think I'm ready to speak when we land. If they ask me, I want to do it right." Leona looked at her. "Do you know what doing it right means?" Ella hesitated. "Telling the truth, that's part of it, but also telling it before someone else rewrites it." Ella nodded, understanding. Her hands trembled slightly. "I've been reading the articles. Everyone's talking about the Aurora Protocol like it's some secret weapon. It's not a weapon. It's a mirror. Then why are people afraid of it? Because mirrors don't lie." Ella stood there for a moment longer, then returned to the galley. Her posture was different now, less hesitant, more resolved. Across the aisle, Mason Dyer was staring at his laptop. He wasn't reading. He was typing something, carefully, deliberately, an internal memo, perhaps, or a resignation. The lines on his face had deepened in the last hour, like the weight of what he had ignored for years was finally pressing against his ribs. Leona knew that look. She had seen it in boardrooms, on senators' faces, on colleagues who suddenly saw what they had refused to confront. The moment when discomfort turns into guilt, and guilt demands action. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a different alert. Pending legal inquiry opened by Federal Transport Ethics Division. Witness statements requested, estimated time of arrival 1 hour 43 minutes, media flag global level 3. Awareness. She closed the notification without reading further. It was already moving faster than she had expected. Too fast for some, not fast enough for others. She glanced again at Amira, still asleep, but now holding her notebook tightly in one arm, as if it were a shield. Leona leaned back into her seat and let her mind drift. Back to the early days, when she first built Aurora, when no one would fund it, when the mock-ups were laughed at in think tanks. Too emotional, they said, too theoretical, too focused on feelings. She had cried one night in her lab after a review committee rejected her grant, not because she didn't believe in her work, but because she realized they didn't want systems that made people feel. They wanted statistics, not stories, but stories were the only thing that ever moved people. That was why this flight had become something more than a delayed departure. It had become a story. And not just of a slap, but of a shift, of a quiet little girl who did not scream, who did not shout, who simply pressed a button and turned the sky into a courtroom. Someone cleared their throat gently near the front of the cabin. A woman stood up and spoke softly. "Excuse me, I'd like to say something." The cabin turned. She was tall, with graying hair and a scarf wrapped around her neck. She looked like a professor, or maybe a poet. "I watched what happened earlier, and I want to say this to the mother of that little girl. You are not alone. I have 2 granddaughters. They travel often, and I have lived long enough to know that what you did today will make their next flight safer." Leona said nothing. She only nodded. Another man stood from row 6. "I'm a teacher, middle school. We talk about ethics all the time, but I never imagined seeing it in action like this. Thank you." One by one, others began to speak, not loudly, not dramatically, just real, just human. A young woman admitted she had almost changed seats when she saw Amira in first class, thinking the row must have been overbooked. A flight attendant confessed she had been afraid to report incidents before, because she feared the system would protect the uniform, not the truth. A teenager whispered to her mother, "I want to build things like that, things that notice when people get hurt." And in the center of it all, Leona sat still. This wasn't applause. It wasn't praise. It was witness, something the world had denied her for so long. She had learned to stop asking for it. Now, it arrived without permission. Not because people were perfect, but because silence had finally cost them something real. Her phone buzzed again. Another update. Media alert. Major outlets confirm identification of Aurora Protocol author. Headline: "The Woman Who Made Planes Listen." Trending worldwide comment: 800,000 authors and rising. She closed her eyes, not out of pride, but grief, because it had taken a slap on a 6-year-old in a cabin of strangers to make them listen. Amira stirred, blinked awake. "Are we close? Almost. Did anything happen while I slept?" Leona smiled softly. "Yes, but this time, it was good." Amira sat up straighter, looked out the window. The stars were gone now, replaced by soft city lights far below. The sky had begun to lighten at the edges. Dawn was arriving somewhere, and with it, a kind of rebirth. Leona leaned over and whispered, "You changed something today." Amira didn't answer. She just reached out, took her mother's hand, and squeezed it tight. The descent began quietly. Passengers buckled their seatbelts, the cabin lights softened, and the flight attendants walked the aisles with a new stillness. Not routine, not robotic. Something slower, more thoughtful, as if everyone had silently agreed not to disturb the weight of what the sky had witnessed. Leona Sloan sat upright, her posture unchanged. her hands folded neatly in her lap. Amira was awake beside her now, eyes watching the window but not seeing it. The clouds passing were only white smears. Her thoughts were elsewhere. The plane felt like it was gliding through something heavier than air. It wasn't just gravity. It was reckoning. Ella Chen passed them again, stopping briefly to offer a gentle nod. Leona returned it. She didn't speak. There was nothing left to say between them. Words had served their purpose. Now came choice. Ella moved on to check another row, her shoes barely audible on the carpet. Across the cabin, Mason Dyer was whispering on a secure call. The tone of his voice had shifted. He wasn't defending the company. He wasn't negotiating damage. He was explaining why the silence had to break. Leona heard fragments of his voice. Yes, I saw it myself. No. She didn't escalate. It was the child who activated it. Yes. Aurora responded correctly. I'll prepare a witness briefing on landing. She leaned back, letting his words fall behind her. She didn't need to listen anymore. Not to justify what had happened. Not to explain what her daughter had done. The moment had passed for defending the truth. Now it simply existed, unshakable, unspun. Outside the window, the city stretched toward them, a grid of gold lights and faint roads. Landing approach had begun, and so had the countdown to the next phase of this story. Leona glanced at Amira. How are you feeling? Okay, tired. A little. Are you scared? Amira paused. No, but I don't want to talk to cameras. You won't have to unless you want to. Good, another pause. Then will they listen to you now? Leona didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for her daughter's hand. They're going to try. But what if they pretend again? Then we remind them how by existing louder than their silence. Amira nodded as if she understood. Maybe she did. In her own way. In her drawings. In her way of noticing the world and organizing it without noise. Leona looked down. Amira had begun sketching again. A new image. A heart. Inside it were staircases. The same steps as before. But this time, they didn't lead upward. They branched out sideways, like bridges. She labeled the drawing Echo Network. A tear nearly rose in Leona's eye, but she blinked it away. She had cried enough behind closed doors, in boardrooms, in washrooms, on late-night flights when she wondered if anything she built would ever matter. Now she knew. It had never been about if it mattered. It was about when it would be needed. The captain's voice came through, calm and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for final descent into Hartley International. Weather is clear and we'll be landing in approximately 15 minutes. Please ensure your seats are upright and tray tables are stowed. Leona looked out one last time. The city of Hartley was sprawling, a hub for corporate headquarters and federal offices. The place where JetBridge's largest shareholder meetings were held. Where Senate subcommittees had grilled her 5 years ago and told her the skies were not a courtroom. Funny, she thought. They became one anyway. A notification appeared on her screen. Press Advisory Aurora Incident acknowledged by CFG Alliance. Flight 191 report confirmed CEO Julian Rhodes en route to Hartley International FT'd Ethics Tribunal. Pending. She stared at the name Julian Rhodes, CEO of JetBridge, the man who once told her that real change came from quarterly earnings, not courtroom tears. The man who vetoed Aurora's rollout twice, only to be overruled by government mandate 3 months ago. Now he was landing in the same city, probably scrambling, probably rehearsing words like unfortunate and isolated and deeply regret. Leona adjusted her seat belt. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only readiness. beside her. Amira looked up. "Will we go home soon?" "Soon. Maybe we'll. They ask us a lot of questions. Maybe can I just draw if I don't know what to sew?" "Yes. You can always draw." The cabin grew quiet again as the wheels prepared to meet the earth. And for one long breath, Leona let herself feel it. The entire sky, the weight of every other flight where something like this happened and nothing changed. The mothers who never got headlines, the children who didn't press a button, the witnesses who stayed in their seats. All of it settled in her chest. Then the wheels touched down. A soft thud, a breath, a future. She felt the brakes hum beneath them. The cabin jolted gently as the plane slowed. Passengers sat still. No applause, no chatter, just anticipation. As they taxied toward the gate, the crew prepared the cabin. Final instructions were given, luggage checked, bags zipped, but all Leona could hear was her own heartbeat. Steady focused, unapologetic. When the seatbelt sign clicked off, no one stood immediately, not like usual. Instead, people turned toward her, not in spectacle, but solidarity. A businessman in first class handed her a card. "If you ever need policy backup, I have people." A mother in row 6 nodded at Amira. "My daughter's watching the news right now. She thinks your little girl is a hero." Ella approached, handing Leona a sealed envelope from the captain. He didn't want to make a scene. Leona opened it. Inside was a single sentence handwritten in blue ink. The sky needed someone to remind us how to behave inside it. She folded the note and tucked it into her coat as the door opened and the jet bridge connected. Leona rose slowly. She looked down at Amira and said, "Ready?" Amira stood and took her hand. "I think so." As they stepped into the corridor, flashbulbs popped behind the glass. Reporters waited beyond security. Officials with FTED badges stood ready with documents. And in the distance, beyond all of it, stood Senator Karina Holt with her arms crossed and her eyes locked on Leona. Leona didn't flinch. She walked forward, not into chaos, but into consequence and the quiet promise of change. The airport terminal was a wall of glass and bright lights. But the temperature shifted the moment Leona Sloan and her daughter stepped off the jet bridge. Not physically, emotionally, like stepping into a storm that hadn't broken yet. Security flanked both sides of the corridor. Not aggressive, just present. A line of FTED officials waited beyond the private gate exit, clipboards in hand and eyes scanning faces with quiet precision. Senator Karina Holt stood closest to the end. Her posture was erect, a silhouette of resolve in a world that so often folded under pressure. Her suit was a deep navy. Her gaze didn't waver. Leona held Amira's hand and walked slowly. She didn't rush. She didn't shrink. She allowed every step to register, as if anchoring the memory into the floor beneath her. When they reached the final gate checkpoint, Karina stepped forward. She spoke softly. "You don't have to say anything, but I needed to be here when you landed." Leona looked into her eyes. "You already said something. You listened." Karina nodded and turned to Amira. "And you changed the way the world understands silence." Amira looked down shyly, gripping her notebook. She didn't speak, but she nodded. A woman from FTED stepped forward. "Dr. Sloan? We've arranged a private suite for you to debrief and rest. There's no press access on that floor. You're in control of when the next steps begin." Leona appreciated the phrasing. In control. She hadn't felt in control for most of the last 12 hours, but now maybe a little. As they walked toward the elevator, a small group of passengers from Flight 191 passed by in the opposite direction. Several of them paused, Recognizing the moment, a man in his 30s gave Leona a firm nod. She nodded back, a mother-mouthed, "Thank you," toward Amira. The girl blinked in surprise, then waved softly. Inside the elevator, the world went quiet again. Just the hum of air vents and the soft whisper of rising floors. Leona stared at the numbers as they blinked upward. 345. Her mind wandered, not to the incident, but to what came after. To the meetings, to the testimonies, to the inevitable flood of counter-narratives. She knew how these things worked. She had studied it, lived it. Systems rarely collapsed after one moment. They cracked, then braced, then rewrote themselves to survive. The danger wasn't that JetBridge would deny what happened. The danger was that they would shape the memory of it, make it digestible, make it isolated, make it go away. The elevator opened with a soft tone. The suite was simple but elegant. 2 rooms, one with a large window facing the airfield. A gentle breakfast tray waited near the table. Muffins, tea, bottled water. A small folded card read, "Welcome, Doctor." Sloan and Amira Leona sat on the edge of the couch. Her legs finally felt heavy. Amira climbed onto the other end, opened her notebook again, and continued drawing. This time, it was a bridge, long, steel, unbreakable. A knock at the door startled them both. Karina entered, alone. She didn't sit right away. She looked around the room first, as if assessing whether it was safe for truth to exist here. Then she lowered her voice. "Julian Rhodes is on the tarmac. He's preparing a press statement. He's claiming internal investigation is underway, and he's open to collaboration. But his body language is all corporate fear." Leona tilted her head. "Does he know I'm here?" "He does. He also knows you're not going to stay quiet. Which is why he's asked for a closed-door meeting. I don't take private meetings with men who ignored my last 6 memos." Fair Karina took a seat across from her. "What do you want this to become?" Leona looked at her. "What it already is, more than a PR fire." "More than that. Then name it." Leona leaned forward. "This isn't about apology. It's about restructuring access to dignity. It's about auditing silence and penalizing delay. It's about children never having to activate something to be treated like people." Karina sat back, silent. Then she nodded. "I'll support that. What will it cost you?" "Votes. Supporters. Friends on the airline lobby." "Then why do it?" "Because I watched a 6-year-old girl remind a plane full of adults what ethics sound like without saying a word." Leona exhaled, deeply. The fatigue hit her all at once. Her shoulders dropped. Her eyes softened. "I'm so tired. Karina, I know I wasn't trying to make a scene. I just wanted to protect her. Just once. Without a system explaining why I couldn't, and you did know." She protected herself. "I just built the button." They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Karina said, "We'll need to draft a public statement. Not just for the press, for policy. Something that doesn't just react, but reframes the expectations. I've already started it." Of course, you have. Leona handed her a file from her bag. Inside were bullet points, data, ethical precedents, suggested phrasing for new federal standards. And at the very end, a short paragraph in Amira's handwriting. People should not get hurt just because someone thinks they don't belong. Karina read it twice, then whispered, "That's the real headline." They talked for another hour, reviewing timelines, legal structure, press options, media rotation cycles. Through it all, Amira sat by the window, drawing quietly. She had begun a series now, each image connected to the next by thin pencil bridges. One showed a plane. Another showed 2 figures standing between walls of people. One showed a button surrounded by light. and the last one showed a child standing in the middle of a circle. No walls, no shadows, just space. A knock came again. This time it was Mason Dyer. He entered cautiously, carrying a folder. "I've submitted my report. I named Sandra. I named the gap in training. I named myself, too." Leona looked at him carefully. "What made you do it?" "Because I'm not proud of how long I didn't." He placed the folder on the table and turned to Amira. "You shouldn't have had to be the one to start this." Amira looked at him, but someone had to. The room went quiet. Then Karina stood. "There's a press briefing in 1 hour. I can lead it, but your voice will carry more weight. If you're ready," Leona stood. "Slowly, I'll speak, but I won't perform. No one's asking you to good," as she reached for her coat. She glanced at Amira. "You coming with me?" Amira shook her head. "I want to stay and draw." "Okay, I'll come back soon. Promise always." She kissed her daughter's forehead and walked toward the door. The ground still trembled beneath her feet, but this time it wasn't fear. It was the beginning of an aftershock, one the world could no longer ignore. Leona Sloan stood behind the curtain of the press room, the hum of cameras and voices just beyond the divider. She adjusted the collar of her dark blazer and closed her eyes for a moment. The lights were bright, even from where she stood. In that half step between backstage and spotlight, the silence pulsed louder than sound. Senator Karina Holt leaned in gently. "No one's expecting you to explain the world. Just speak the truth of what happened." Leona nodded. "That's the problem, though. The truth doesn't feel like enough anymore." She took one deep breath and stepped through the curtain. The room went silent. Reporters lowered their phones. Camera operators adjusted focus. Even the tapping of keys halted for a second as she walked to the podium and looked out across the room. Behind her, the official seal of the Federal Transport Ethics Division was projected on the wall. A symbol that once felt like paper now seemed to carry the weight of a country watching Good Afternoon. Her voice was steady, not loud, not soft, just intentional. "My name is Dr. Leona Sloan. I am the creator of the Aurora Ethics Protocol and the mother of the 6-year-old child, whose alert was triggered on Flight 191 yesterday." A murmur swept through the room. The directness disarmed them. There were no opening jokes, no scripted sympathy. She continued, "What happened on that plane was not an isolated incident, and what my daughter did was not a heroic act. It was a necessary one. She pressed a button because adults in that cabin had failed to act, because the people paid to protect her chose silence, because the system in place taught her that obedience was expected, but dignity was optional." Cameras clicked again. Phones vibrated as quotes hit social media in real time. "My daughter does not understand policy. She understands fairness. She understands that when someone puts their hands on you without cause or respect, something must answer." Leona's voice held steady, but her hands gripped the podium tighter. Now Aurora was designed for that moment. For the moment after trust breaks, but before the world gaslights you. For the space between violation and narrative. She paused. This isn't just about Sandra Blake or JetBridge Atlantic. It is about a culture that still doubts the voices of the quiet, that dismisses composure as compliance, that calls a black child too much or too loud, even when she says nothing at all. The room was so quiet now that the camera shutters sounded like raindrops. "I am not here to request an apology. I am here to demand change, measured, structured, enforced, not press releases, not suspended contracts, change that has weight behind her." Senator Holt nodded slowly. Leona finished her statement. Aurora did its job. Now it is time for the rest of the system to do theirs. She stepped back. There was a beat of stillness. Then reporters raised their hands all at once. The moderator pointed to a woman in the second row. "Dr. Sloan, do you plan to take legal action against the airline? I plan to support any action that makes children safer and employees more accountable. If that includes litigation, so be it." Another question. "Has your daughter spoken about the event since it happened?" Leona hesitated, then answered truthfully. "She has drawn about it. She speaks in symbols. She builds justice in shapes. That's how I know she is still processing it." Another reporter jumped in. "Do you think the Aurora system should be expanded to all domestic flights?" Leona replied immediately. "Not just domestic, international. The skies are not neutral. They carry bias like cargo. If we have systems for turbulence, we should have systems for harm." A younger reporter near the back asked, "Are you afraid of the backlash?" Leona looked straight at her. "Of course I am. But fear is not the same as surrender. My fear will never be greater than my responsibility." More questions followed. Most were predictable. A few were sharp. One reporter asked if Leona had engineered the protocol to force compliance from airlines. She replied, "No. I built it to remind them of the compliance they promised in their policies, but abandoned in practice." The moderator finally called time. Leona stepped back from the podium and walked behind the curtain again. Her hands were shaking now. Just a little. Karina was there. Her arms folded, but her expression soft. "You just changed the next 5 years of airline ethics. That was never the goal. What was that my daughter would never think of herself as a problem." They walked together down the hallway toward the exit. Outside the press room, the air felt different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. The crowd outside was growing. Some were protesters. Some were supporters. Most were just watching Leona reach the elevator and paused. She opened her phone. A new message had come in. No subject line. Just a name in the sender field, Julian Rhodes. The message was short. "Dr. Sloan, I have read your statement. I would like to request a formal meeting tomorrow morning. Not to defend. To listen, I will come to you." Respectfully, Julie and Leona stared at the screen. Then she locked the phone. Karina looked at her, going to reply. "Not yet, why not? Because I need him to understand this isn't a negotiation." They rode the elevator up to the suite. When the doors opened, Amira was sitting at the small table by the window. She had drawn something new. Leona approached quietly and looked over her shoulder. It was a new flowchart. This one was labeled "The Story They Tell." The first box said what happened. The second said what they say happened. The third said who gets believed. The fourth said what we remember. Leona swallowed hard. "You did another diagram." Amira nodded. "They're easier than explaining. You don't have to explain anything to me, I know. But someone might ask, do you want to talk to anyone?" "No, I want to finish this one." Leona sat beside her. She didn't say anything more. The light outside was starting to shift. Evening beginning to fall across the city. Planes lined up on the runways, their lights blinking like constellations, each one carrying lives, stories, versions of justice waiting to be triggered. In that moment, Leona realized something. The press room might not be a courtroom, but it had become a stage for accountability. And in this version of history, the quiet girl in row 2 had become the witness the world could no longer ignore. And the next steps would not be hers alone to carry. The night air in Hartley was unusually still. A soft breeze moved through the trees outside the hotel suite. But inside, it was the kind of quiet that made you hear things louder. Your own thoughts, your own doubts, every word that had been said, and every one that hadn't. Leona Sloan stood barefoot on the carpet. staring at the city lights below. The press conference had ended hours ago, but the world had only grown louder since. Her name was trending on every major platform. Her daughter's image, blurred but still recognizable, was now a symbol in headlines. Some praised her, some questioned her, some argued she should have stayed quiet. There it was again, that word, quiet. Leona closed her eyes. She had taught Amira that silence could be a form of resistance, but now, that resistance was being dissected by strangers, turned into hashtags, into talking points, into something marketable. And that, more than anything, made her stomach turn. Behind her, Amira had fallen asleep on the couch, curled up with her notebook still in hand, pages filled with diagrams, circles and boxes and tiny arrows, a world of logic for a world that had failed to follow any. Leona walked quietly to the table and opened her laptop. She had intended to write out the next version of the Aurora Systems expansion plan, but the screen stayed blank. Her fingers hovered over the keys, then fell to the side. What she needed wasn't a policy draft. It was clarity. A knock at the door startled her. 3 soft taps, then a pause. She walked slowly and opened it to find Julian Rhodes standing there. No entourage, no assistants, just him, in a dark coat and expression that gave away more than his press statements ever would. He looked smaller in person, not physically, but in presence. "May I come in?" Leona stepped aside without speaking. He entered, removed his coat, and stood awkwardly near the door. "I came alone. That much is clear. I didn't want to turn this into a negotiation. What did you want to turn it into?" "A reckoning." Leona tilted her head slightly. He wasn't performing, at least not in the way she had expected. He looked at the couch, saw Amira asleep, and lowered his voice. "She's the one who pressed the trigger. Yes, that system you built worked exactly as designed, and your airline worked exactly as broken." Julian didn't argue. He sat down slowly in the armchair opposite her. "I reviewed the internal logs. I read the stewardess report, the ethics officer's statement. Your child's silence was recorded for 42 seconds before anything changed. She only needed 10. He looked away. I failed. Not just in oversight, in design, in culture, in courage. I built a company that rewarded metrics and ignored morality. Now you want redemption? No, I want responsibility. That's rare. That's overdue." They sat there for a moment, not as adversaries, not quite as allies, just 2 people standing on opposite sides of a truth they could no longer avoid. "Do you know what it's like to watch your child try to disappear in front of strangers? No. Do you know what it's like to design a system you hope never has to be used? No. Then let me tell you something." She stood and walked to the window. Amira has always been the kind of child who listens more than she speaks, who observes everything. That's why it hurt even more to see that even her silence was treated as misbehavior. Julian listened. The Aurora Protocol was never about giving someone power. It was about giving someone a pause, a sacred pause, the kind that forces people to choose decency before the moment passes. He looked down at his hands. "And yet, we treated it like a threat, because you were afraid of what accountability sounds like when it isn't loud." She sat down again and looked at him. "So what now? I'll resign. Publicly. Before the board can offer me some graceful exit. That's not enough, I know. Then what else? I'll fund a foundation. One not tied to JetBridge. Focused on ethics in transit. Designed and led by people like you. Not advisors, architects, mothers, builders. You'll fund it, but you won't control it." "Agreed. And your apology will not be a press release. It will be a policy shift, one that doesn't put your face on a cover, but puts your daughter's dignity in the system. She paused, then nodded. You might be useful after all. They both allowed a small breath of levity to pass. Not a laugh, just relief that the walls between them had cracked enough to allow something through. Julian stood. May I say one more thing to her? Not tonight. She needs rest. She's had enough strangers in her day. Understood. He moved toward the door, then paused. You know, when Aurora first got submitted for trial, I called it over-engineered, I remember. But now I realize you didn't overbuild it. You overbelieved in us. That's your burden to carry. He left the door closed quietly behind him. Leona sat in the quiet again. But this time, it felt different. Not empty, not tense, just quiet. She looked over at Amira again. The girl stirred slightly in her sleep, then whispered without opening her eyes. Is it morning yet? Not yet. Baby, then I can dream a little more. Leona smiled softly. Yes, dream as long as you want. She returned to the table and opened her laptop again. This time, her fingers moved. Not just policy, not just strategy. She began typing a letter to every child who has ever been told their silence is suspicious, to every parent who has watched their kid shrink to fit the world, to every witness who stayed quiet but wanted to stand. This system is not perfect, but today it heard you. She saved the file. She would send it tomorrow. For now. She just sat back and let the silence hold her like a new beginning. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains of the hotel room. A gentle warmth touched the edges of the pillows where Amira still slept peacefully. Her small hands clutched the well-worn notebook filled with sketches, diagrams, and words that had become a map for justice. Dr. Leona Sloan sat quietly in the corner, sipping a cup of coffee that had long since cooled. The night's conversations and decisions lingered in her mind, a mixture of exhaustion and hope weaving through her thoughts. Today was not just another day. It was a turning point. Leona glanced at her phone. Notifications poured in, not just from the media, but from families, advocates, and even strangers thanking her and Amira for sparking what was now being called a revolution in aviation ethics. She smiled softly, remembering the moment on the plane when Amira pressed that small silver button, the moment that had not erupted in noise, but in undeniable truth, a silent signal that had shattered decades of complacency. The Aurora Protocol was no longer just a concept. It was law. Policy, a shield for those who had long been ignored. Her phone buzzed again. This time a message from Senator Karina Holt. The bill passed committee unanimously. The Senate hearing is scheduled for next week. Your testimony will be the centerpiece. Let's keep building momentum. Leona felt the familiar surge of determination. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life. But now the stakes were higher than ever. Amira stirred, opening her eyes slowly. The sunlight caught her curls, making them glow. She yawned, then smiled at her mother. Did I do good, Mama? You did more than good. Baby, you changed everything. Amira reached into her backpack and pulled out the small silver button, now dull from constant use, but still heavy with meaning. Will people still press this? I hope they never have to. But if they do, the world will listen now. Leona leaned over and kissed her daughter's forehead. The journey ahead would not be easy. Opposition was already mounting. Airlines reluctant to change were mobilizing their resources. Lobbyists whispered in the halls of power. Some questioned the legitimacy of a child's role in this transformation. But the quiet truth remained. A 6-year-old had reminded the world that dignity could not be negotiated or ignored. Leona stood and moved to the window, looking out over the city awakening beneath a sky that felt less hostile today. The streets bustled with life, unaware of the quiet revolution taking flight above. She thought of all the mothers and children, the witnesses and survivors who would now have a voice, a system that would no longer allow them to be erased. Her phone rang. It was a call she had been waiting for. Senator Holt's voice was calm but urgent. The hearing is scheduled for Tuesday. The press is circling. Are you ready? Leona took a deep breath. More than ready. It is time. As she ended the call, she looked down at Amira, who was now drawing again. This time it was a mural of smiling faces, open doors, and airplanes soaring through clear blue skies. The girl's voice was soft but clear. Mama, do you think the sky will always listen now? Leona smiled, tears welling in her eyes. I think it already has. And with that, the room felt lighter. The air felt freer. A new day was beginning, one where silence no longer protected harm, where truth did not have to shout, where dignity was a right, not a privilege, and where a small girl's quiet courage became the spark that changed the world. As Amira's silent courage sparked a movement that shook an entire industry, we are reminded that dignity is not a privilege reserved for some, but a right owed to all, especially the smallest and the quietest among us. This story is a powerful call to recognize the harm caused by discrimination and the urgent need to hold systems accountable. But beyond anger and outrage, it leaves us with hope. Hope that change is possible when we listen not just to the loudest voices, but to those who refuse to be erased. Amira's quiet strength teaches us that sometimes the most profound courage is spoken without words. Thank you for watching this story of justice, resilience, and transformation. If it moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to join the conversation and help amplify voices that demand respect and fairness. Stay with us for more stories that inspire change and remind us all that everyone deserves to be seen, heard, and valued. Until next time, keep standing for what is right.